Today, we will explore whether the abominable poverty in Africa is one of God's commandments or the result of science and politics. Africa, the third largest continent in the world and one of the richest in natural resources, is still considered the poorest in monetary terms, according to the UN. But first, please like and follow me to receive notifications of similar content and help the channel grow. About a third of African families live below the poverty line, and 40% of the continent's wealth is in the hands of less than 0.1% of the population, showing a sharp inequality. The disparity is so great compared to other countries that only Germany, for example, a country 83 times smaller, generates more than 1.5 times the wealth of all of Africa every year. Even though the world has become increasingly wealthy, Africa still seems much poorer than any other continent. But why is Africa really so poor? And how did Europeans destroy much of the African economy? These are some of the questions we will answer throughout this video. A large part of our script is based on the literary work of Nathan, a renowned economics professor from Harvard. You will be impressed by Nathan's research arguments. Sources in the description. There could be various reasons for Africa's continued stagnation in poverty. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what caused this, but one of the main factors cited is how European presence throughout history may have been decisive in this. So let's go back to the 15th century. This was the map of Africa, a continent with various kingdoms and city-states. Generally, the most powerful nations were located on the coast of the continent. Meanwhile, the interior mostly consisted of more primitive peoples and weaker kingdoms. This power imbalance allowed the stronger nations to penetrate the interior and enslave the weaker peoples, selling them in the coastal markets. At that time, there were 4 main points of trade for the slave trade. The largest and most well-known was the transatlantic trade, where, from the 15th century onward, slaves were sent from West Africa, Central West Africa, and East Africa to European and American colonies. The other 3 routes are known as the Trans-Saharan trade, the Red Sea trade, and the Indian Ocean trade. During the Trans-Saharan trade, slaves were taken from the south of the Sahara Desert to North Africa. In the Red Sea trade, slaves were taken from the interior of the Red Sea and sent to the Middle East and India. And in the Indian Ocean trade, slaves were taken from East Africa and sent to the Middle East and India, similar to the Red Sea trade or to plantation Brazil in the Indian Ocean. But going back more specifically to the 15th century, Europeans, needing cheaper labor, began trading slaves with African kingdoms. Thus, the demand for slaves increased, and more primitive peoples from the interior were captured and sold on the coast. As if that wasn't enough, with the discovery of the Americas, demand exploded, and increasingly, European ships on the African coast sent slaves to the Americas. Thus, Europeans found a perfect cycle that worked as follows. First, they left Europe, bought slaves in Africa, crossed the Atlantic to the Americas, where the slaves could be resold and exploited again. With this cycle continuing for centuries, the coastal African kingdoms seemingly continued to prosper because they sold the weaker peoples from the interior, and this was a great business for them. But this may have harmed the entire African continent, causing poverty for centuries, to the extent that Professor Nathan produced this chart. Basically, it shows the relationship between economic growth in 2 groups. The first is the countries that exported the most slaves, which experienced very low growth during the 20th century. The other is the countries that exported the least slaves, showing that they grew much more. In other words, there seems to be a direct correlation between countries that exported the most slaves and poverty. Nathan's conclusion about slavery is that the slave trade resulted in the weakening and underdevelopment of African political structures. In other words, slavery impoverished Africa and fragmented it to the point that it is difficult to rise. One example of this is the Kingdom of Congo in Central West Africa, where by 1514, the abduction of local Congolese citizens to sell them to the Portuguese had become widespread, threatening social order and the king's authority. In 1526, Afonso, the king of Congo, wrote to Portugal saying that there are many merchants in all corners of the country, bringing ruin to the nation. Every day, people are enslaved and kidnapped. including nobles and even members of the king's own family. In other words, slavery could have really destroyed the entire structure of African governments, to the extent that there was a time when slavery was so intense that Petrarch, the prestigious historian from the University of Pittsburgh, estimated that by 1850, Africa's population should have been double what it was if the slave trade had not occurred. But perhaps Africa's major problem came in the 18th century. Essentially, the Industrial Revolution exploded in Europe, and one thing was clear: Europeans were now producing on a large scale and, over the centuries, needed one thing more and more: natural resources. And that's when Africa became not only a focus of slavery, but also of resource exploitation. By the end of the 19th century, demand for raw materials increased, and Europeans began the colonization of Africa to meet this demand. Thus, the map changed. It was no longer a route to the Americas, but rather a subtraction of the continent's natural resources directly to Europe, a true resource-sucking machine. As a result, the African kingdoms that once existed were now controlled by European and white minorities, who were obviously there with exclusively European interests, excluding local leaders and only exploiting Africa's resources, sending them directly to Europe. To grasp the extent of this, here is the map of Africa in the 20th century. It was almost entirely controlled by European powers. Up here in the north, in blue, was a French colony. Here in the southeast, a British colony. In the middle of Africa, a Belgian colony, and many other colonies such as Portugal, Spain, Italy, and even Germany. This meant that African powers were subjected to European interests, which certainly did not aim to help Africa. This leads us to understand why Africa became poor, not only because of the extraction of wealth, but primarily due to the elimination of development on the continent, as the sole purpose of Europeans was to exploit resources. This excluded any development projects for the continent and any welfare projects for African populations, which did not happen on a large scale like in any other continent. Other continents had many slaves, but Africa was a center of exploitation and slavery. Colonialism and slavery also severely harmed Africa's production structure, as while other continents had labor producing for themselves, Africa did not have this advantage, often because labor was exploited for foreign powers rather than for the African continent itself. Thus, African nations were unable to achieve high development and were subjected to extensive exploitation. So much so that by the end of the 19th century, the slave trade resulted in the disintegration of the Kingdom of Samba, the Kingdom of Ignal, and the state of Pare in the Pangani Valley, East Africa. And colonialism lasted until the 20th century and destroyed much of Africa's economic development, causing almost all of the continent's current problems. One of these is governmental instability. Today, African countries face numerous coups, militias taking control of countries, etc. This only happened because of the lack of structure in African nations, which were exploited and prevented from creating their own base during colonization, allowing anarchist groups to emerge due to the lack of a strong government force. Of course, there may be many other factors that influenced poverty in Africa, but looking at it generally as something that happened across the entire African continent, it is possible that slavery and colonialism were the main factors that harmed Africa. And all this leads us to understand why Europeans nearly completely destroyed Africa's past. Portugal, for example, only left the continent in 1975, and Africa's last colony ended in 1990. As a result, Africa's structure and wealth became very fragile.